Welcome, everyone, to this keynote event for April Poetry History Month. My name is Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Director of Special Collections and Archives, and I want to express my gratitude for your joining us online. After Professor Bathanti's presentation is completed, we will open up both YouTube and Zoom for you, the audience, to submit questions live for him, and he will be able to respond. So Professor Bathanti received his BA and MA from the University of Pittsburgh and his MFA from Warren Wilson College. He joined the Appalachian State English Department faculty in 2001, and he is Professor of English and McFarland Family Distinguished Professor of Interdisciplinary Education. He is the former Poet Laureate of North Carolina, 2012 to 2014, and recipient of the Order of the Longleaf Pine and the 2016 North Carolina Award in Literature, the state's highest civilian honor. He has also been recently named to the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. He is the author of over 20 books spanning multiple genres, including poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and personal essays. Bathanti's co-edited volume, The Anthology of Black Mountain College Poetry, will appear from UNC Press in late 2024, and his novella, The Stranger, is forthcoming in 2025. And Joseph, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, especially at Wake Forest University. I feel like I have special ties there. I've been on campus a number of times, served a week as a writer in residence, maybe in 2017. And my oldest son is an alum. I think he graduated in 2009. What I wanted to do this afternoon is read a number of poems. And of course, the title of this program is Demystifying Poetry. So I'd like to demystify the title. The title has to do with, I feel like people tend to look at poetry as a really esoteric art, as something that is a little more difficult to decipher and get into than prose. So I really want to read a spate of autobiographical poetry and just talk about where those poems come from, how I came to them. I'm more or less a narrative poet. I do write autobiographically, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those poems are about me. Let me just give you a little bit of background on my childhood. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I'm the grandson of Italian immigrants. My father was a union steelworker. My mother was a union seamstress. So a lot of my work is very much influenced by my ancestry as an Italian American and the son of working class people. The first really good poem, or the first good poem I wrote, is a poem called Palo Mio. It's about my father's father, who immigrated to the United States in 1907. And he was a blacksmith. I remember writing the first draft of this poem longhand in 1981. I still have the manuscript. It's a little gnarled and yellow, at my mom and dad's dining room table. And as I was writing it, I felt like I really cracked into something significant. Not because it's a terrific poem, although it's almost my favorite poem that I've written, but because in that poem, in the writing of it, I was starting to get the hang of going from general to specific, of what I call thingness, of getting imagery and texture and description and narrative into a poem. Because I feel like poems need to be accessible in the same way that the prose often is. I'm not an experimental poet. I love experimental poets and poetry, but my work is pretty linear and pretty narrative driven. Title of this poem is Palo Mio, which really means my Paul. Carrying a smith's tools in a land which would not brook his fire, he planted seeds, and each year the birds took his first fruit, leaving him to rave woodenly like a false prophet, one eye blind, the other like a smoke marble. When his wife died, he buried her out of country in a hill filled with Lutherans and never returned. Hiding in the grape arbor, I felt his anger coursing through me, and even then I knew that I was his Hercules. With one eye squinted, I can see his now boxed body alive in the shuttered room where he slept alone and danced the tarantella in Sunday shirt and gold watch, brooded over Chianti and fierce parodies. His daughters, whom he could not distinguish from fishwives, pulled me from the door, but after he was drunk, we all heard him rasping his compline in dialect, roaring with the blasted mouth of the soldier, invoking Jesu and Garibaldi in one breath. There are relics of him strewn throughout the garden, watch chain, cigar stubs, shards of shattered bottles, a broken spade. His shirt flaps in the wind. The scarecrow wears his fedora. I lift my hands to bless the birds that swoop down on these elegies. And within that poem is a story that is perhaps murky. He buried his wife in a hill filled with Lutherans. My dad's mom died during childbirth when my father was only 5 years old in 1920, and my grandfather ended up burying my grandmother in St. Peter's Lutheran Cemetery simply because he identified St. Peter as a Catholic saint. And that became a kind of scandal in the family that my grandmother was spending eternity among Lutherans. Imagine. Although I kept assuring them that she had been there so long that by that time she had probably converted them all, because they were threatening to exhume her and put her in the Catholic cemetery. This next poem is called Confirmation. Might be obvious, I grew up extra Catholic. It's kind of interesting that today is Good Friday. And confirmation is one of the sacraments that little Catholic children have to go through, roughly around 6th grade, maybe 7th grade. I was taught by nuns for the first 8 years of parochial school, elementary school. I always think of myself as having just a charmed childhood, one of the last great childhood, except for the nuns. They were pretty vicious. So when we were leading up to confirmation, our teacher told us that during the ceremony in the church in front of the entire congregation, that the bishop would ask us questions, just single us out from the crowd and say, hey, you, and then ask these pretty involved questions, which terrified me. The idea that I would be singled out. I was 11 years old and asked these questions and was so afraid of failing at those questions in front of everyone. So I pathologically scoured the questions and the liturgy and the catechism and memorized down to the syllable those questions. Here's what happened. The poem's called Confirmation. Sister Simon grilled us for weeks on the questions the bishop might ask at random. I memorized the principal parts of the Mass, the sacred vessels, liturgical colors, commemorations, the stational churches of Rome. But the bishop asked nothing, gave but a dry slap and palsied stamp of chrism. I remember only that his name was Thomas, that his green mitre shook as he asked what name I had chosen. My godfather wore a white tie and clamped my shoulder. Suddenly, a soldier in the army of Christ, I couldn't stop thinking of the girls in my class, their long, straight hair, and consecrated bodies. I had taken the name of a man who became King of France at age 15 and led 2 crusades to the Holy Land. What did I know of how men fought and loved? At the party, I was given money. Aunts kissed me. Uncles shook my hand and coaxed me into a shot of whiskey. All I wanted was to be alone. In the home movies, I'm a sweet boy in red blazer holding a bottle of Lord Calvert. Everyone about me laughing. So psychological torture, you were told that you'd be asked these questions, and you studied like mad for fear of being disgraced in front of everyone, and then no questions were asked. So the neighborhood that I grew up in, it's a now vanished Little Italy. It's called East Liberty, and it's being gentrified, which is always a word that worries me. But when I was a kid, it was kind of a magical place. So many Italian people. And what happened, I think roughly in 1963, 64, 65, this happened all over the United States. There was something called urban renewal, where cities went into entrenched, really wonderful neighborhoods and essentially bulldozed them to make things better. And of course, they made things worse. Our house was quite literally torn down. I think my parents were given $5,000 for it, and we had to move. The same with my grandmother, a lot of aunts and uncles as well. So this poem in East Liberty really never recovered from that. People moved, became crime infested, and it's only now, how many years later, goodness, better part of 60 years that it's starting to make its comeback. The death of East Liberty. The Catholic had been assassinated, his frontier swept away by glass and brick dust. The wrecking ball emptied the sky like an atom bomb. Half the voters could not speak English to save their homes. They spit on the sidewalk and cursed the tin-horn politicos that stood at the polls to keep their kids working. Women lit candles and went to pieces with their hands. The men sat in rubble and wept with the jackhammers. Trees were plucked and houses bowled over like fleece drunks. In the end, they moved, took the $5,000 their lives had been bountied for, and made a face of beginning. But demolition had crept into the bloodline, a reliance on silence and breaking to chastise love. Memory became the abstraction of vendetta. Italians went to their graves without speaking, wholly terrified of America. I want to mention, I think it's really important that as I was growing up, as I was seeing these things happening, I wasn't thinking in terms of poetry. I wasn't thinking someday I'll write about these things, but they were all infiltrating me in ways that I was unaware of then. So that when I began attempting to write, and I really decided I wanted to take a crack at writing in high school. I went to a really amazing high school, Pittsburgh Central Catholic, a life-changing place between 1967 and 1971. And I had Christian brothers and also lay teachers who put books in my hands, like Molotov cocktails, took us to films. It was a really, really, really intense time in my life and a very happy time. So when I started writing, the first thing you search for is language, and you go into those crypts within you. We all have tapes in our heads of films of our lives, but also tapes of people speaking to you. So this isn't the kind of language necessarily I would ever speak conversationally, but this is a more compressed, boiled down, rendered language that came about as I began to try and write maturely. And that took years to get to that place. That doesn't come right away. I'm always harping to my students that there is no writing, only rewriting. So what you're hearing now are final drafts that I might have worked on for just years and years and years. So the next poem is almost like a found poem. And a found poem is something like you might see something in a newspaper that attracts your attention, and you sort of steal that language. Graffiti often is found poems. So one day, after I moved to North Carolina, I don't know when exactly, I kept in touch with my parents all the time. We talked on the phone just all the time. And it was wonderful because I was able to keep in touch with them and feel like I was still living in the neighborhood, because my mother, especially, would rehash just very pedestrian things that were going on. So I don't know how it happened, but one day we were on the phone talking about my sister's birth. How we got onto that subject, I can't quite remember. So my beloved sister Marie, was born in 1950. And it was a terrible year for a terrible winter. Marie's born in January. It was a terrible winter because my dad was on strike from the mill the entire time my mother was pregnant. And it was a really terrible winter. So as my mother was telling me the story, and please keep your eyes and ears open for stories hatching all around you all the time. As my mother was telling me the story on the phone, I'm pathologically scribbling down everything she says. So the poem I'm about to read, called The Strike Baby, dedicated to my mom and dad and Marie, is a found poem. It came right out of her mouth. I don't think I did anything at all. The only liberty I took is, rather than saying it's about Marie, I am the baby born. And that was, as much as anything, about, it wasn't about vanity per se, it was about craft, because it felt clunky to keep saying Marie, 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 instead of to use I. And I've made amends with my sister. The Strike Baby. And again, this is coming right out of my mother's mouth. $11 a week unemployment, and I wasn't getting pregnant. When I did, your father went on strike. We were renting from Nick and Ida Santilli. They said, forget about the rent until the baby comes. You were due. Your father was on strike. Then winter came, and my God, the snow, the 1950 snow, everybody called it the big snow. I baked bread. We bought produce from the huckster. Daddy painted Abe and Lena Vento's house. They bought us a crib, so we asked them to be godparents. The days Daddy got paid, he brought home a 20-cent pie. It cost $110 to have a baby, 9 months care and delivery, calcium and vitamin pills. 2 days after you were born, the strike ended. Imagine a 20-cent pie. So today's Good Friday. I hope you'll permit me a little profanity, not because it's Good Friday, but because the name of this poem is Son of a Bitch. It's a baseball poem. And I want to say this too. Some of the first writing I did was about sports. I played a lot of sports. That was my whole life for years, and played in high school and 1 year in college, etc. So this is a baseball poem. And embedded in it is a real lesson I learned. There was a kid, I use a different name, Johnny Petro, although that isn't his name. And he was the kid that was not so good at baseball, but it was quite clear he didn't want to be there, but his imperious father was insisting he be there. I was only 8 years old, but I could tell right away that dynamic, and it made all of us angry. We didn't like Johnny's dad, who was one of the coaches. So it's interesting when that kind of recognition comes in. You know, again, we would be irritated because Johnny wasn't such a good player, but we really despised his dad because he was so unkind to our friend. Son of a bitch. Johnny Petro's dad, Al, was a son of a bitch. His fellow coaches, including my father, had no use for him. Excluded, red-faced, he looked like Lee Harvey Oswald. Get in front of it, Al commanded, forbidding Johnny to flinch as he clubbed him vicious grounders with his big Hillerick and Bradsby .35, a cigarette stealing out of his mouth like a bullet, the ball tearing rabid along the mined field. Take it in your chest. What are you afraid of? My father had known Al for years, but said little aside from the times, often enough, when Al crucified Johnny because of a boot or strikeout. My dad would tell him to let up, and Al would wheel menacingly, then smile when he saw who it was. I thought it took something secret to brand a man son of a bitch, murder or sins of impurity, more than baseball, more than fathering a boy who couldn't catch, had no arm, no swing, a boy smart enough, too smart, Al would mutter, to realize there was no future in 1963 on that glassy, pocked field down on Larmer Avenue. Are you a statue? Al would bellow in the middle of an inning when a ball shot by Johnny, then mimic his son, standing motionless, head hanging, arms drooped at his sides, the two of them identical, still as marble, except for the boy's squint behind his glasses. So little kids, they understand when adults are no good. And I also think the negative model is a good model because we sometimes learn how not to be. And I never wanted to be anything like Al. Certainly a side note to that is my dad was just a pretty dreamy dad. So in the vein of sports, and because Wake Forest University plays sports, has quite a basketball reputation, and good baseball players too, Wake Forest, absolutely. But I think maybe Wake's known more for its basketball tradition. I'm not sure. Y'all could tell me that a little better. So I want to read a basketball poem. And this one's kind of a true story, with you know, a little embellishment. It's called JoJo. It's about a great friend of mine who's still a great friend of mine named Joe Costanzo. And I don't need to tell you much about this poem, but this is a real story that happened when I was, I think, a senior in high school, 1971 in Pittsburgh. And all you need to know that there's a point in this poem where somebody jumps up in the stands and mimics the coach's voice. And I think it's probably universal to mimic, make fun of your coaches, your teachers. I hope that tradition is still in vogue. This is called JoJo. And I will tell Joe, that I read this poem today and he'll be thrilled. And he would know all about Wake Forest basketball. It's late in the game. We're playing Canavan in our gym, a bandbox so small the people sitting on the bottom bleachers squat to keep their feet off the inbounds. Less than 20 seconds and Central's down one. Joe Costanzo's bringing the ball up. Coach Killian's on his feet. Every kid in the school can do an imitation of his voice. Jojo loves having the ball, can't keep his hands off it really, and the outside shot is his trope, kind of two-hand knock-knee jumper. But he never actually gets off the floor, the ball with a lot of arc, leaving his hands, which twist counterclockwise, giving it a reverse English as it snaps through the hoop, the net cracking like a stick, then turns itself inside out. And the ref has to get it back down by throwing the ball up through the underside of the rim. Joe shoots a lot, more than he has to, but he can score. On a good night, he hardly misses. He'll throw in 40, 50. He's captain, all Catholic, totally conscious of every move he makes. He's invented himself and pulled it off. You can see it when the team comes out to warm up, the way he swoops in for his layups. The sweet Georgia Brown blares over the PA, and Central's tiny gym begins to rock. Joe's a sweet guy, no denying. Number 44 in your program, number 1 in your heart, he signs everyone's yearbook. The clock shows 15 seconds. There's time to work it in to one of the big guys for something close. Draw the foul, 2 from the line, at least 1 and 1. Tie it up, overtime. Play the percentages. Canavan's working a half-court man press, so they pick up at center court. Jojo right in the middle of the jump circle, dribbling, the clock dwindling, when Russ Benko, one of Joe's boyhood friends from St. Rosalia's in Greenfield, everyone standing now, banging the bleachers with their heels. The whole gym literally vibrating, the walls sweating. Russ yells in his best Mr. Killian imitation, "There's nobody better than it." You'd think it was him. His wife would think it was him. Russ yells, "Shoot it, Jojo, shoot it!" And Jojo, the dead half court, the guy all over him, never hesitates, just throws it up, that quirky twist way up, ball seeming to spin in 6 different directions. Killian can't believe it, bending over and beating his thighs with his fists, squeezing his head between his hands. He's going to kill Jojo. A cockeyed half-court jumper with a man open under the boards. Jesus. That goes in without touching the rim, as if there were no rim, just an invisible hole in the air that only Jojo and the ball know about. The net there simply to swoon like lace on its halo of orange steel. True story. This next poem is called Wheeling. So he grew up in Pittsburgh. If you look at a map, Pennsylvania is kind of a rectangle. Pittsburgh's in the lower left corner. And just west of that lower left corner is West Virginia. So the legal drinking age in Pennsylvania was 21. The legal drinking age in West Virginia was 18. So you know where this poem is going. And again, you all have these kinds of stories. I do want to say that poets and writers don't have the market cornered when it comes to stories. Perhaps they're just, I don't know, narcissistic, neurotic enough to feel like they need to write them down. But my stories aren't any more important or poignant than yours. And a lot of them are certainly driven by memory. Memory is the mother of the muse, as the great poet Robert Lowell says. So dig into those memories. And I would say as well, don't worry horribly about getting things right from a documentary perspective. Rita Dove, the great African-American poet, says, and I paraphrase just a tiny bit, memory is compassionately inaccurate. So what I'm saying is the poem is what's important. It embodies a kind of psychic truth. even if it's not absolutely according to what happened precisely. Wheeling. Driving the girl whose father loathed me, son of an Italian who labored on the open hearth, I crossed in a borrowed green Comet the PA line into Wheeling. 18 was legal in West Virginia. Marlboros and 3-2 beer at the hilltop on a street with 4 houses and a Jesuit college. She was 16, a minor. The true minor secreted in black, sulfurous pockets, whispering beneath the tavern floor we sat upon. The jukebox was loud and country. It was easy to ignore the charge being laced under us. My girl was drunk and singing along Loretta Lynn, Tammy Wynette, though she didn't know the words, the way folks mouth like speaking in tongues when the spirit lays hold of them. A smudge on her cheek, secondhand coat, her blonde hair shone white in that light, aged into a coal miner's wife, or steelworkers, like my mother. When the 4 to 12 shift from Wheeling, Pittsburgh dragged in, I smelled asbestos and baked ore, the vaporous green sizzle of my father's work fatigues. I wanted to tell her all about her father. I'd rip him to pieces, that bastard. My dad was a brave man. He climbed boom cranes with nothing but a span of leather fastening him above the smokestacks, streaming 12 stories of fire into the firmament. But I had no vocabulary to render his mythic toil. I knew more about her dad, his suits and office in downtown Pittsburgh, his perfect diction and college education. We hung around till last call, then kissed against the fender until the lot emptied and the hilltop's neon shingle sputtered out. The Comet wouldn't start. I turned it over and over until I killed the battery, till I couldn't get a peep out of the horn of the lights to flicker. The mighty Ohio beat by, whelped in Pittsburgh. It loops north in defiance of gravity, abruptly slices west, southering into the fang of northern West Virginia that impales the border of Ohio and Pennsylvania like the long, jagged neck of a busted bottle. That's where we stood, clinging to each other, stranded along the omniscient river, where I still like to think of us before those miners, like escaped purgatorians, burst black and smoldering through the bottom of our lives, and she started to cry, anticipating her father's patrician wrath. I thought of who I could call, knowing there was only one man on earth who would rise out of his exhausted sleep at the sound of my voice, like Lazarus, and come running. And of course, that was my dad, who did come running, who I called. And he didn't say anything at all. My dad would never embarrass me. He didn't say anything that night. So again, my dad was a steelworker all his life, and retired from U.S. Steel after the better part of 47 years. One of the things that he did is he would climb cranes, and he was a mechanic, among other things. He could kind of do anything and fix them. And he had this great saying, "Son, it's not the fall, but the sudden stop." So this next poem is called Knocked. But it's not like knocking on a door. It was a saying that I heard growing up. If people said that she hasn't knocked, he hasn't knocked, it was synonymous with having it made. He has it made, she has it made. So, my dad was a quiet, dedicated by my sister's lights and mine, kind of a saintly person. He went to work, he came home, he never complained. He never talked about work. He's a good dad. He's my little league coach. He was a great dad. And I had a great mom too. But I wasn't curious about his life at all, you know? I wasn't curious about the mill or what he did or how he spent his days. I was kind of protected from all that. And I feel a little ashamed about that now. So I was this poem is about my first time, the first time I ever saw the mill that my dad worked in. And I was 17. We had one car, like a lot of people then. 63 Chevy Bel Air that I learned to drive on. So I needed the car for the after prom picnic. You know, we had the prom, and then the next morning you have an after prom picnic back in those days. And so that morning of the after prom picnic, I dropped my dad off at the mill and kept the car so that I could have the car. And then I went back and picked them up at the end of the day. Knocked. I was 17 before I saw Edgar Thompson, the steel mill where my father had worked since he was 17. And only then, because I needed his car for the senior after prom picnic, the theme was Color My World. Sleepless, having danced all night, a furnace of cheap champagne, and still in my tuxedo, I dropped him off at 7 a.m. in Braddock, named for a Revolutionary War general. 3 bars in every block, streetlights turned on in the afternoon so the kids could see their ways home through the ore dust. The mill was blue and corrugated, rising in shaft after shaft of smoke that sawtooth into gray sky, so that I never saw its top. The men in the boom crane cabs wore hard hats and drank coffee. They had it knocked, my father said, but not him. He had to climb the backs of those monsters. When I was little and insisted I wanted to be like him and work in the mill, he'd snap, "No, you're not. You're going to college." In a few months, I really would be going to college. Working in a steel mill was the last thing I wanted to do. My father eased out of the car, handed me a 20, told me to be careful, pinned on his millwright's badge, and filed into the smoke with the others. I turned up the radio, dropped the engine into low for torque, and floored it, sure that in one night I'd had more fun, more love, more everything than he had had in his life, and I wanted to get back to it as fast as I could. So that image of my dad filing into the smoke with the others strikes me as that's what a real man does. He files into the smoke with the others and brings home his paycheck, and feeds his kids and puts shoes on their feet. And my mother worked too, did the same thing. In the poem, I didn't think of it when I was writing it, but it reminds me of the famous poem, Those Winter Sundays, when Robert Hayden says at the end, what did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So we sometimes only really understand our parents' lives much, much later before we have the opportunity to thank them. I'm going to read a poem called Restoring Sacred Art. It's about my best friend, Philip DeLucia. And I wanna dedicate today's reading to Philip, my best buddy, my communion partner, my older son Jacob's my Wake Forest boys, godfather. Philip's gone 23 years today. One of the things, what he did for a living, towards the end of his life, is he restored sacred art. He quite literally did what Michelangelo did. He'd lie on his back on a scaffold and essentially restore sacred art, those statues, those ceilings. So many old Catholic churches and Orthodox churches in Pittsburgh that were built, gosh, I don't know, sometimes in the middle 19th century, late 19th century, and they were just beginning to deteriorate. So he would hire out. He was a fabulous visual artist. He was a painter as well, and would make his living that way. So when you visited Phil in his apartment, often too, he would have statues and icons. He lived in one of the Little Italies in Pittsburgh. So he would take those folks, sort of deteriorating statues, and repaint them, replaster them, fix them up so that his apartment was a bit of a reliquary. So this is really a kind of true story of one time my helping Philip load up this life-sized statue, very heavy, of the Madonna into his car so we could then drive it to his house and towed it up into his apartment so he could paint it and restore it, etc. And we did this. We carried it for quite a while down a city street. So it's a funny poem too, and not a funny poem. Humor's very important in your writing. And again, this is for Phil. This reading is for Phil. Restoring sacred art. We ease the statue out of the Chevy trunk. Stiff as a mob hit, she smiles, tattered robe, della Robbia, nimbus studded with a star tiara. In her arms, the smirking Christ child is lean and grim, in one hand a ball with a cross planted in it, the other held up like a Boy Scout pledge. I grab his mother in a headlock. Philip takes the feet, and we shuffle down Liberty Avenue. Saturday night, the bar's glass brick windows lit with neon Iron City light beer signs. One Italian joint after another. The spars of St. Joseph's Cathedral shooting off into the sky like wild onions. We set her down for a minute at the foot of Phil's studio and light cigarettes. 4 flights, 15 steps each, straight up. She stands there on the sidewalk, holding the baby, gazing at St. Joe's, the Catholic store, Minio's Pizza, the halogens twirling off across the Bloomfield Bridge towards the bishop's house. The kid doesn't like it, the thrum and noise, the lights. He's lived all his life in the church. We hoist him again, begin the climb, pausing at each landing to rest and crack at Mary. You've got to lose some weight, too many cannolis. When are you going to start exercising? We offer her a smoke. At the top, we wrestle her inside. Phil turns on the light. The baby has lost those 2 fingers. Only the thumb remains, jutting out of the fist like a hitchhiker's. He wants down. In the full light, Mary is wan, tired, the smile thinning. She has trouble holding her son. Her eyes are wet. Her lips quiver. This is not unusual, my friend tells me, gesturing about his workroom where other virgin mothers nicked and beat up, missing limbs and noses awaiting restoration, hold tightly to their squirming children, trying to hush them, their tears like gravel hitting the linoleum. Next poem's called Betsy Wetsy. I mentioned my sister earlier. So she had, I guess this was kind of a phenomenon at this, I don't know, 50s, 60s, where they had dolls that actually wet themselves. How unusual, right? And Marie had a doll called Betsy Wetsy. And to me, it was like one of those Twilight Zone dolls that sort of reanimated and could cast spells on you. I was little. I would hide the doll, and the doll had kind of an eye that had gone wonky, and it would just move in weird ways. So this is called Betsy Wetsy. Apprenticed to motherhood, Marie made potholders on a wee loom and gave Betsy Wetsy her teeny bottle with real formula that disappeared with each prurient suck of her plastic mouth, bright red, coquettish, pursed like Betty Boops, the same black burlesque curls, starlit lashes, looks that spelled trouble, etymology of the word doll. One of her blue eyes was tetched. It lolled open of its own volition. Marie loved her all the more for it. Betsy Wetsy could wet her singular feet, her raison d'etre. What we all waited for. Scandalous. A hole out of which pee dribbled, soaking her dotted Swiss. Marie bathed and diapered her. I despised her undressed. Mother washed her clothes with ours. My father built her a cradle. I thought she was one of us, that eye fixed on me. So again, I would hide Betsy Wetsy, and it was, and then Marie would look for it and then say, Joseph took Betsy Wetsy. You have those stories, I promise. Okay, this poem is called Brooks Brothers Shirts. It's really a tribute to my mother. My mother was a seamstress, a union seamstress. And she worked in the basements of some of the most exclusive men's clothing stores in Pittsburgh. And because of that, and she worked at Brooks Brothers for a long time in downtown Pittsburgh. And because of that, working there, she got these great discounts. So my mother's very clothes conscious too, and knew about clothes. She knew all about them. She was a scholar of men's clothing. So because she got these discounts, she brought me, I was dressed for a while exclusively in Brooks Brothers clothing, shirts especially. And it's interesting, my mother's been gone, gosh, almost 20 years, and I still have boxes of Brooks Brothers shirts that I've never opened that she would send me. She was certainly very worried about my apparel. I love her for it. Brooks Brothers shirts. 10 hours a day. My mother hunched downtown in Brooks Brothers tailor shop, fretting cuffs and belt loops, pleats, vents, buttonholes, lapels into ruthless wool suits, unthinkably expensive for men who spent their days unsoiled, whose soft hands never raised a callus. After she punched out, caught the streetcar and high-heeled home 2 icy downhill blocks from the Callow Hill stop, she often breezed in with packages. Icy broadcloth shirt she'd monogram with my initials swathed in smoky, silvery tissue. The deep navy boxes piped in gold, the gold band that bound them, and in their centers the Brooks Brothers coat of arms, a golden hue lowered on a sling into a sacrificial grail, the Agnus Dei. My mother dressed me like a prince. Apparel doth proclaim the man I'd one day read in Hamlet. Those luscious shirts, the forbidden glory of plenty, of too much really. They privileged me among my parents' oppressors, every day with neckties, blazers, oxblood, penny loafers, Princeton wave that swooped my yearning brow. I wore them to school, blue, pink, yellow, charcoal and burgundy, pinstripe, tattersall, blinding ecclesiastical white. I wore them to church. I adored those shirts, my immaculate patrician destiny. My mother washed them by hand, hung to dry in the winter sun, spritzed with water from an Iron City pony, then shelved them in plastic bags overnight in the freezer. She loved them as much as I did. My father, a steel worker, a crane climber, he loved them too. He didn't want me to get my hands dirty. He wanted me to work for myself. My mother ironed in the cellar where my father shaved, out of an enamel basin with hot water from the wash tub, a small mirror on a nail pounded into the block wall he whitewashed every year. On his workbench, she stationed a sleeve board for the long tedium of the crease, true as a plumb line, dabs of starch, collar and cuff, shots of steam from the iron's black button. Mother's needle hand steering the hissing wedge just shy of scorching the frozen fabric, which is the charm. My shirts were sharp enough to bring blood. Monday through Friday, school, then Sunday, high mass, the shirts awaited me, dangling on hangers from the cellar's copper ceiling pipes, 6 of them in a skirmish, nudging from the cellar's copper ceiling pipes, 6 of them in a skirmish, nudging one another in the darkness, complicit in my certain future, swaying slightly like a slow dance in the heat fence tepid whisper at their throats, the oval writ, Brooks Brothers makers, established 1818. And this one's just called Joe and Rose. It's from my mom and dad. Joe and Rose. I'm named after my dad. And my dad, once he retired, he never really retired. He volunteered and he did this and that. And he'd also plant these enormous gardens. And I think this poem kind of speaks for itself. Joe and Rose. This year, my mother insists my dad not break ground. She doesn't want him out of her sight. All he needs to do is fall. She asks if I notice a difference. He's thin, holds his coffee in 2 hands. No garden this year. But he doesn't listen. He rents a patch along the golf course. Too big. What's he trying to prove? He goes about it the same way as always. Seeds and plants, manure and fertilizer, in good conscience, in sacramental care. He drives up the slope, his long-handled spade, hoe, and rake tied in the trunk. Across the fairway, he drags the hose, spirits home to my little boys the golf balls he finds. A dozen kinds of lettuce, 30 tomato plants, peppers, eggplant, delivers it all to my mother. She doesn't know what to do with it. My God, Joe, it's just the 2 of us. She brags about his garden, how at 90, he can outwork any kid, how hard his head is. So I'm going to read 2 more poems. This next is called Burying St. Joseph. There's a Catholic tradition. I don't think it's exclusively Italian, but I hope it is, that if you're having trouble selling your house, that you should bury a statue of St. Joseph, and miraculously the house will sell. The poem tells the story. And there's a moral to this story too, folks. Please always listen to your mother. Burying St. Joseph. When after 42 months, the farmhouse we left behind in Statesville has not sold, I finally heed Mother's directive to bury in the yard a statue of St. Joseph. He will effect what no realtor has the savvy for. My mother presents this as dogma, the same causal inevitability as landing a little place in heaven through rosaries and novenas. Along the pump house, above which hover impatience and demure lily of the valley, I drive a spade, drop to my knees with my old friend St. Joe, one in a third grade spelling bee, 2 inches of phosphorescent plastic that gleam miraculously in the dark of my first bedroom on Prince Street. He's traveled house to house into my manhood and marriage, his wry smile faced over the years. In his right arm clutched his baby boy, the unsuspecting Christ, like a sack of 3 penny finishing nails. As instructed, I inter him head down in the fashion of Peter's crucifixion, face him east to assume the sun by day, all night the moon. He ignites the subterranean quartz and hiddenite pulled above him on the parched earth's surface glows a crown of milky light. Black widow spiderlings flash their scarlet fetish and scatter in the rosemary. The house sells in a fortnight. True story, friends. 42 months that house was for sale, and I buried the statue, finally listened to Mom, and boom, the house sold in 2 weeks. This last poem is called Steady Daylight. I was imagining my mom and dad in heaven, what their lives are like. I think we all have an idea of the afterlife, what it's going to be like, what you do, what you don't do. That is, if you believe in the afterlife. So I imagine my dad's 105th birthday and the whole family, all the rest of the people, my extended family and friends and everybody that's up in heaven, getting together for a party. Steady daylight. Today in heaven, my father turned 105. Finally working steady daylight, he's got it knocked. 8 to 4, double time and a half, no asbestos, no shoveling slag on the open hearth, no depending from a boom crane, 6 degrees and sleet, no boss, 13 weeks vacation annually, kingdom come. The union up here takes no shit. Home well before dark, traffic mellow, blue sky, nothing but green signals, plenty of time, once home. Perfect parking spot right in front of the house to sit a minute, smoke a Camel, sip an Iron City Pony beneath the olive and lemon trees he planted when he first arrived 368 days after my mother to celebrate their 59th anniversary. They grow well in heaven, mild weather year-round like Puglia, save for snow on holy days and feasts. He shaves and showers in the cellar. My mother has his clothes for the party laid out on their bed. Khakis, short sleeves, summer white shirt. The party's at Aunt Lou's. Everybody there at each stage of their lives concurrently. Another time this would have struck them as outlandish. Not now. They were poor. They suffered. Now they're happy. Money's not an issue. No one gets sick. No one gets hurt. The neighborhood's safe. Everyone gets along at all times. They act reasonably. Light surrounds them. It's that kind of place. Angels from the ether bear platters of ravioli from Grosseria Italiano in Bloomfield, sausage from Joe Grasso on Larmer Avenue, lemon ice from Moyo's, sfogliatelles from Barsati, Parmesan, aged for eternity, scungile from Umberto's clam house that Uncle Ralph scored from a Detroit crony, wine from the wedding feast at Canaan. My mother made the artichokes and baked my dad's favorite egg custard pie, every single candle, 105. Joe looks good, says my mother, says my dad. Give me a kiss, Rose. With no hesitation, she dips in. Long brown hair, brown eyes, red lipstick, sassy 40s dress, halo hovering like lilac. My dad's taken to rope sandals and straw fedora. They're movie stars. She sits on his lap. He looks at his watch. Tomorrow's another working day, he says, and winks. They form a conga line and weave the rooms and halls, up through the bedrooms, into the attic, singing Grandma's Lye Soap. Aunt Margaret deals blackjack at the big dining room table. All the food is still out, but they decide to cook again. Peppers and eggs, hot sausage, black velvet. The blonde in the black velvet dress and pearls on its label turns itself and trickles upside down into shot glasses. Chubby checker on the turntable, the kids doing the twist. Uncle Pippi starts with the Italian songs. Papa twirls Aunt Teresa in a tarantella, and suddenly winter, it begins to snow. Here they are saying goodbye, time to go home, kissing, bundling babies, shackling chains to cars. My father helps his mother, Maria Cristina Bocchicchio, down the steep stone stairs to Leamington Avenue. He's not seen her since he was 5, 100 years, cent'anni. On his right arm, his hammer arm is tattooed an American eagle, arrows in its beak, above which unfurls mother. He must have gotten it in the army. How could I have never asked? Angelo stands to his knees in snow and plays his lost violin. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for coming today. We do have a couple questions that have come in for Professor Bathanti, who's here to answer them. If you have other questions, please submit them in the YouTube chat, or you're welcome to submit them in the Zoom chat. And Professor Bathanti, the first question is, you mentioned how your poetry is informed by your life experiences. How would your poetry be affected, do you think, if you worked at Wake Forest instead of App State?
Wow. Well, I'd love to work at Wake Forest at some point. And I actually was a writer in residence there for 1 week during a sabbatical, maybe in 2017. And I've spent a lot of time on that campus because my older son spent 4 years there. You know, that's a tricky question. Well, one thing, it would be decidedly affected by the different geography. Wake Forest and Piedmont, so I would be looking at a different kind of geography, a different kind of landscape. And up here, I'm affected very much by the altitude. Before we moved to the mountains, we spent our entire life, about 25 years, in and around the Piedmont. So I've written about that, but I think more than anything, it would probably be the landscape. For instance, it's full-blown spring where y'all are, and we're expecting a snowstorm tonight. But I think also the climate of the campus, there's a certain regal mien to Wake Forest, you know. Also a different kind of student body. I'm affected by everything around me, the very ether, the people that I talk to, etc. But in terms of autobiographical poetry, I think I'd still be digging in on the kinds of poems that you heard earlier today. People peg me as, you know, a Pittsburgh poet because that's where I grew up. And they're not wrong, but about half of my books are located in North Carolina too. So it would be a different kind of region for me to write about, different kind of students, colleagues, etc. You know, so in my next life, I hope I get the opportunity to teach at Wake Forest.
Thank you. Another question is, how do you balance your teaching and your writing?
I absolutely don't. I don't feel like I balance anything, to tell you the truth. I mean, life comes at me like a lot of people in a madhouse crossfire. And I just, even in job interviews, you're asked things like, how do you do this and how do you do that? And my answer to that is, I don't, I get things done, if that makes any sense. I stay up late. This is worth saying though. When I'm in the throes of teaching, and I am really in the throes of teaching right now, after starting Monday, we only have 3 weeks of class left. And really during the semester, once it heats up, probably after the first month, I especially privilege my teaching and my students' work over mine. And I've always done that. I feel a kind of pressure to be an employee and to be a solid professor and mentor to my students that I don't sort of feel with my writing. I stay up late. Sometimes I write for an hour at night. But I also think that reading is really important to writers. It's kind of like athletes watching game films. You're always stealing, you're reading like a writer, you're staying fit, you're training for that writing. I'm fairly productive, but a lot of that stuff has been in the hopper for a while. You end up starting so many more things than you finish because it's way more fun to start a poem or a short story. And endings are notoriously impossible, I think, for writers. So I'm often going back to earlier stuff. I'm redrafting it. For instance, I have a novella. I want to say about 45 pages of a novella that I probably put together initially about 15 years ago. And I think it's good, but I don't know how to end it. So I'm always back in those last 2 pages trying to figure out an ending. And I go back to it and back to it and back to it. And often I'm just dealing with very small things. One thing about being a poet as well as a fiction writer and an essay is that you can have a half hour with a cup of coffee in the coffee shop and maybe scribble down 2 or 3 lines and feel like you're still keeping your hand in it. So it's a trick. And I'm also a family man and do a lot of other things like all of you. So I don't have any magic formula except keep your shoulder to the wheel and, I don't know, stay up a lot of hours every day and enjoy yourself.
Right, here's another question. How long did it take to demystify poetry and your chosen path in the arts for your family? And thanks for pulling Betsy Wetsy out of my brain.
Ah, yeah, everyone has Betsy Wetsy if you're a certain age, I think. So the question is, was I able to demystify it for my family or for myself?
Your chosen path and
hmm,
your family, and how did you demystify that?
well, my chosen path was such a pipe dream. I wanted to be a writer. I mean, my heavens, how in the world does that happen? It happened with a lot of luck. It happened with the fact that I had landed in North Carolina, such a beautiful and generous state when it comes to writing. There were, really extraordinary, what I would think of as the big shot writers who welcomed me to join them, sit at their table, even though I had done nothing. So a lot of that was just training. I'm sorry for all the sports metaphors, but you want to run a marathon, you don't go out the first day and run 26.2 miles. You kind of work up to it. But I would say, I think I mentioned earlier, I'm a family man. So, kind of family first for me. I guess by the time my children came along, I was already I was already a writer. They thought of me as a writer, although I rarely, talked about my writing with my kids. Wouldn't that be horrifyingly boring? For myself, the way I demystified it, that very first poem I read, Paulo Mio, about my grandfather, I was able to finally demystify the process of poetry by moving into being a narrative poet, where I wasn't simply talking about my feelings. Carolyn Forche, the great writer, says, don't write about your sensibilities, write with your sensibilities. So the idea there was to get something in front of the reader, something cinematic, something imagistic, something with thingness, not I'm feeling really blue today. That's telling. You have to show somebody being blue, and you never tell. You don't have to put the word blue in. They see that happening in a cinematic fashion in the same way they would a film. The filmmaker never comes out on stage and tells you what you're looking at, just like the playwright never does. So that it took a while for me to get that. It really did. It took it took a long time. And then again, reading other poets, finding my range, everyone, I think I mentioned that writers don't have, the story market cornered. Everyone, all of y'all have wonderful stories. Absolutely. Somebody who mentioned the Betsy Wetsy poem. There's a Betsy Wetsy poem in your head, and there were a lot of poems triggered in me because I read other poets and I said, man, that happened to me too, or I'd go to a reading. Y'all have readings on campus all the time. You have a beautiful literary tradition that goes way back at Wake Forest. I would go to a reading and I would hear somebody read something about, say, I don't know, the first time they saw the ocean or the first time they saw their father cry, something that maybe was in my brain pan that I hadn't thought about for a long time. And I thought, wow, and boom, you're instantly transported back there. And I will look forward to getting y'all sending me some Betsy Wetsy poems, So read other poets, it's just like if you play baseball, watch a lot of baseball, and you watch technique. You try to do what the maestro does. Often you can't do it, but you find out what you can do. You find out your range. Every kid, can't be an all-star, but can enjoy the game really in profound ways.
Well, now I'm looking forward to this volume on Betsy Wetsy poems.
I will absolutely edit that volume if we can get enough of them. There are millions of people haunted Betsy Wetsy, I would bet.
All right, this next question comes from me, and that is, you provided poems for documentary photographer Houck Medford.
Yes.
For a work that he did, photographs of Rising Meadow Farm in Liberty, North Carolina. And I would like to ask, what kind of inspiration did you use from his images? And what was that experience like to work with a visual artist?
It was a fabulous experience. I had done that earlier in my volume, Light at the Seam, with Carl Gailey's poems on mountaintop removal. Carl and Houck are friends. So I got an email kind of out of the clear blue sky from Houck, inviting me, would I partner with him on this? Our paths had crossed, but only once and briefly. And I instantly said yes, just because, I don't know, it struck me as a really wonderful adventure. And we live out in the country. We have a neighbor across the road who has a sheep farm. So I'd seen sheep a lot. I've seen sheep sheared. I'm not a sheep scholar, but I love North Carolina, and I knew that country in Randolph County, and the idea of being up to my elbows in sheep in a farm out there. I love the natural world. Hal presented me with a few incredibly seductive images that I thought I can write about that. So the big challenge so I was inspired to do it. And it was going to be a coffee table book. I mean, holy cow, I had never been involved with something like that. And Houck's a renowned photographer, so that was an honor to work with him. So these were very different kinds of poems than the poems I read this afternoon. Not narrative in this same vein at all, very imagistic, often impressionistic, often experimental, even on the page. So that was fun for me because I stepped outside of my comfort zone. And often, too, as kind of a narrative poet, autobiographical poet, I can get sick of myself. I don't want it to be about me. So I was able to have poems where I wasn't the speaker, but I also did a heck of a lot of research. I researched sheep and sheep farm. How can I spend a lot of time together just in conversation? I went to Rising Meadow Farm 2 or 3 times. I was there for sheep shearing day. I got to know Ron and Ann Fay. So I was on the ground. I really immersed myself in this documentary project. It wasn't all in my head. None of it was in my head. I had to witness it. I had to be there. And that's another kind of really interesting, wonderful experience for poets and any kind of writers. I mean, if it's documentary poetry. You go where it is, and then you do the research. And I surprised the heck out of myself. I didn't know where any of these poems were coming from. And I don't want to, since it's called Demystifying Poetry, I don't want to now over mystify it. Although I do think there's a lot of magic that occurs if you live long and hard with your subject and allow it to talk to you. So it's a wonderful experience. And it was kind of hard, but hard in the best kinds of ways. And I got to know a whole side of life that I would have never known had I not initially got that email from Houck. And the pleasure of just being in the company of such extraordinary people like, Ron and Ann Fay, and then Houck and KB Medford. I mean, it was an adventure that went on for pretty intensely, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. Yeah, it was great. It was fun. It was fun, got to get in my car and drive around North Carolina, which has been one of the great joys of my life.
One final question. What advice do you have for new poets?
Okay. First of all, I would say read poetry just pathologically. Something that's really interesting to me is that I'm a creative writing teacher, and there are a lot of young poets yearning to be poets, but they haven't really read much poetry. So you have to have something to mimic, something to copy. Another sports analogy: how do you know you want to be a baseball player if you haven't watched any baseball games? We live in a prose world. Cookbooks, sports page, novels, you name it. Everybody's familiar with that kind of narrative. We've all read those. So we have a model of what it looks like on a page and how to write in the sentence. But we don't have too many models of poetry except in the classroom. Typically a family library or a family bookshelf or whatever might have a book of poems, it might not. In all my travels, I've never seen anyone just reading a book of poems for fun on an airplane, on a train, on the beach, etc. So right now, poetry world is as rich as it's ever been. Not just again the dead white guys, but the extraordinary women in feminist poetry, Latinx poetry in translation from all over the world, LGBTQ poetry, all voices coming from everywhere. So it's phenomenal. So wherever you're sitting right now, you have poems in you, and you can now find a model for that poet. The African American explosion, Afrofuturism. My heavens, it's rich and varied and extraordinary. And the last bit of advice would be, young poets, try not to be really good right away. You don't have to be good. revel in the process rather than the product. Write bad poems, but just write. Don't stop. And another thing is, once you get to the point where you feel confident enough to send your poems out to, say, literary magazines, you're going to get rejected a lot. It's just, it goes with the territory. I mean, I still get rejected all the time, but you cannot take those rejections as a fixed judgment of your worth or your literary ability. This is just some stranger in a room somewhere at a literary magazine who might not be in a position or doesn't have the wherewithal to recognize how good your poems are. So you have to keep sending them out. You have to keep writing. What I'm always worried, and with my students, I think, err on the side of charity, because I would hate to have discouraged a poet today because I'm this so-called expert who maybe in 2 months, I don't know, 2 years, catches fire, but stops writing now because I wasn't encouraging enough. And again, poetry is something you get, poetry, prose, you keep writing, you get better. Keep reading, keep writing, you get better. It's just the way it is. Do not stop. Don't take anyone's fixed judgment on your worth and on your work, And if you ever need extra encouragement, email me and I'll deliver it.
All right, we're going to close there. Thank you so much, Professor Bathanti, for speaking with us today and sharing your insights for Poetry Month. We really do appreciate it.
My great pleasure. It's always a dream to talk about it and to be associated with Wake Forest.
Thank you.
My pleasure.